All right, welcome back from our break. Our next presentation, we've got three more for the day. We've got condors and wolves and grizzlies coming up. And first up, we have Chris West, and I will pass it off to Bob Bailey to introduce him.
Thank you. Really looking forward to Chris West, who's the Northern California Condor Program Manager for the Yurok Tribe. He's been involved with the Condor Pregonish with the Yuroks since about 2015, I believe, and has managed virtually every aspect, been involved in every aspect of returning these magnificent, amazing creatures to the skies over Northern California. I would just say that for us in the Elakha Alliance, the example of the effort it took and continues to take to return these birds is a great model for the work that we are engaged in. The time required, the partnerships required, the planning and the hand-holding and the just the continued effort is really an inspiration to us. So I'm really looking forward to what Chris has to say as we examine the return of condor to the Northern California skies. Thank you. Go ahead, Chris.
All right. Thank you for having me. I'm just gonna get this lined up here. And hopefully let's go. Okay, is that working for you all?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, as was said, I am Chris West. I'm the manager of the Northern California Condor Restoration Program. And I really thank you all for having me here today. I appreciate your interest in our project and how it ties into the Endangered Species Act and the presentations that have been occurring today. I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to give you kind of a little heads up on the pathway we're going to be following today. We'll talk a little bit about condor biology, historical ranges and declines, conservation methods, mostly targeting reintroduction, the progress in Northern California, some of the challenges the program has encountered along the way, and then trying to kind of bring it back to, sea otters and a lot of the other conservation issues being discussed today, specifically with regards to reintroduction and kind of lessons that could be learned from the condor work that's been done. So starting off with condors, really what captures the imagination for most people with condors is they're really big birds and they're very rare. They can have a wingspan of almost 10 feet, can weigh over 20 pounds. We don't know exactly what their lifespan is, closely related species. The Andean condor weighs in at about, has lived in captivity for about 80 years. I was just looking for a timer here. I guess I can follow the timer clicking away on my thing because I've lost my clocks. Condors exhibit lifelong monogamy. So once pairs do kind of form their pair bond, they tend to breed for life. They lay about one egg every other year, so there's an extended parental care period between egg laying. Those eggs, are incubated for about 2 months, and then those young don't fledge from the nest until about half a year. And then those young won't reach sexual maturity until 6 to 8 years of age. And it's this kind of long, kind of reproductive strategy that's caused problems for condors. If you think about other large scavenging birds, such as eagles or vultures, they can have 3 offspring in a single year or 3 fledglings, whereas condors with only 1 chick fledging every other year, over about a 10-year period, they'll produce about 5 offspring, where eagles or vultures could produce 30. So although they're not necessarily more susceptible to mortality factors in the environment, a slight increase in mortality factors becomes more readily apparent in condors, where they can be limited by increases in mortality very rapidly. At one time, condors ranged all the way across of what is modern North America, nesting all the way up into the northern Appalachian chain on the east and down into Florida. And it's likely that large megafaunal extinctions towards the end of the Pleistocene period kind of resulted in range restrictions for the species. You can see this graphic here. Condors ranged at the time of Euro-American settlement to the west, kind of into this area, out into Idaho, Utah, touching into Arizona, and all the way up into British Columbia and south into Mexico. By about the 1950s, you can see this red area where the range was restricted at that time, probably due to interactions with that Euro-American settlement. We had the introduction of lead ammunition being used in harvesting game. There were sealing fleets moving up and down the coast, taking marine resources. There was also widespread intentional poisoning of carcasses on the landscape to limit large predators and their kind of competitive effects with those incoming Euro-American settlers. Another graphic of the population decline you can see from about the 1930s into the early 1980s here at the time of the population low of only 22 individuals left in the world, and kind of how that played out. So in the early to mid 1980s, there was an effort made to take the remaining condors into captivity to save the species from extinction, and basically put them into zoos to start a breeding program. Less than 10 years later, in the mid 1990s, you started to see scenes like this. This is condors being released in Big Sur, California. So it happened very quickly. Luckily for the conservationists, condors actually responded well to captivity. And then very soon after that, less than 10 years after reintroductions were started, you were starting to see young condors being produced in wild nests. So that's kind of the condors in a nutshell, but really getting into the nuts and bolts of how that occurred, there was a lot of stuff that went into all of those different steps along the way. And so I'm just kind of break these things down piece by piece. Initially, refining egg handling techniques was a really big deal. We had birds in nests. There was not a lot known about condors and how they would respond to captivity. And the initial thoughts were, well, let's just start taking the eggs from the nests and taking them into captivity and see if we can rear those birds and start to get a breeding program going. And that worked pretty well, but there was a lot that had to go into that. People didn't know how, what temperature do you incubate a condor egg at? What kind of rate of water loss do we want to see from these eggs so that we can hold the humidity in the incubators at the right humidity level? And kind of all these things that had to be figured out for California condors to make sure that they could successfully hatch eggs. And as that was going along, it quickly became clear that the condors that were still out in the wild were being lost at very rapid rates, and that all of those birds actually should be taken into captivity to conserve their genetics and try and continue egg production in captivity. That presented a whole new suite of problems. How do you keep a condor, a bird that ranges over hundreds of miles every day, confined in a cage and have it behave in a natural way, all the way to where you can actually get it to initiate a breeding amongst pairs in a captive setting. So a huge number of hurdles that had to be gotten through there to get to that point. Eventually, they were successful. As I said, condors bred relatively readily in captivity, which surprised a lot of people. And then you started ending up with condor chicks. So then there had to be a major focus on husbandry techniques for condors in captivity, and especially for chick rearing. So in making sure that all of the genetics were understood for the bird and maximizing genetics diversity was super crucial. At the same time, they had to try and minimize human contacts with birds to try and reduce the potential for birds to imprint on people. We were trying to come up with birds that could actually be reintroduced into the wild. So there was a big emphasis made on parent rearing or foster rearing. But what they did find is you could take an egg from a breeding pair and have them lay a second egg and even a third egg. And so then they started getting a surplus of eggs and then also taking offspring away from pairs so that they would relay and go right into breeding again the next year. So in that case, you could get 4 or 6 even eggs from a pair in a 2-year period, whereas previously you were getting a single egg. And so now with all of these extra chicks, they were trying to foster them away to birds that weren't breeding, even fostering them to Andean condors. And some of the birds ended up actually being reared by hand puppets, as you see in this image here. And there was a big movement to improve puppet rearing and create better puppets. And these puppets are still used in certain situations today, but really the emphasis now is to try and focus on parental rearing whenever possible, being kind of the most natural way to rear a condor chick. So now you've got a whole bunch of birds. So what are you going to do with all of these birds? Well, putting them out into the environment obviously is a good idea. You can see the range. If you guys, hopefully, can you see my mouse on the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so you can see this was that range that was shown from the 1950s. And so a number of release sites were kind of scattered along this area. It was also decided to put a disjunct site out in Arizona in case, some kind of disease or other kind of uh, impact occurred with the population that was kind of burgeoning in the last kind of refuges of the condor. And then eventually down into Mexico as well, and kind of going with this kind of metapopulation approach with a number of different sites that could interact with others while also keeping some disjunct is kind of what kind of the approach that was taken by the program. And then of course you can see the Northern California site way up here, which is the most recent site. And again, coming up with another disjunct site was something that was important. But remember, I also mentioned that condors were at one time extended all the way up into British Columbia. And that's kind of where the Yurok tribe came in with their interest. A lot of the local tribes in the Pacific Northwest had links to condors culturally and spiritually. And so there was a lot of interest in bringing condors back. They were integral to a lot of the top ceremonies, the jump dance and the white deerskin dance, kind of more regionally, which are world renewal ceremonies. Condors gave the condor song to the dances and provided the feathers to and their spirit through their feathers to the dance. And it was believed that because condor flew the highest, that they were the ones to carry the prayers of the people to the heavens when they were praying for the world to be brought into balance. So it's a pretty big deal if the one that actually carries your prayers is missing from your environment. And so it was really important for the local tribes to bring condors back for that and for a lot of other various reasons, including ecological reasons. And so that was kind of what really prompted the Yurok tribe to get involved. So now we've got these different release sites kind of spread across the landscape. Let's kind of delve into the release strategies a little bit. Originally, releases targeted fledge-age birds. People thought it made sense. Okay, birds fledge from nests at 6 months. Let's put the birds out there at about 6 months and release them from the release pens. And it didn't work out so well. There were a lot of challenges related to that. And so, a lot of folks involved in the program were thinking, well, these birds are hanging out with their parents for a year and a half, learning a lot about the landscape, which they can't really learn until they get out there. But they're also learning a lot about how to be a condor socially. And they're a very social species. They hang out in flocks, they roost in flocks, they interact quite a bit. And so they decided to hold the birds in captivity for longer periods of time. And now we're at a point where we hold the birds in captivity for about a year and a half. And during that time, they're learning a lot about how to socially be a condor by interacting with different aged groups in the captive setting and kind of learning all that they need to know about that aspect of condor life. Mentors were begun to be used, so taking birds that were not paired up, that were adults but weren't breeding for whatever reason in the captive situation, and being able to put young birds intended for release into pens with those birds, and kind of interacting with these, very dominant birds and figuring out how to insert themselves socially into the structure so that they could eat with the other birds and roost with the other birds. And you can see this bird on the right side here kind of getting a lesson from an adult bird on, no, you don't get on the roost or the perch higher than me because that's my spot. And so very important stuff for condors to learn to be able to integrate into condor society after release. Now, once the birds get to the field, they have these release and management facilities, what we call the RMF. Different sites call them different things. Ours was funded by some funding from PG&E and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and really all of the sites are pretty much the same thing. And I think of them as like three boxes. You've got your flight pen where the birds hang out, which is this area right here. And then you've got an observation area, and this is just kind of an odd-shaped single box where the biologists and techs can hang out and watch birds through one-way glass. And then we've got the double door trap, which was, it's just kind of tacked on. It connects to the flight pen, to the outside environment, and there's controls in here so that observers within the observation area can actually manually manipulate these doors. So you can trap birds from the outside environment and then introduce them into the flight pen. You can move selected individuals from the flight pen into the trap and then move them out into the wild, so you can selectively release individuals. And this is really much more than a building or just a flight pen. This is really a tool that we can use to manipulate the flock and move birds into captivity, move them out, and then kind of use it also as a social hub to kind of attract birds to it so that it's easy for us as biologists to keep an eye on those birds and manage them. And this is kind of what it looks like from the outside. And this is going to come up later in the talk. People have come to our site and seen this and say, wow, this is like Fort Knox or some kind of a prison facility. It's big and it's bulky. There's a 12-foot electrified fence surrounding 4 acres of land around it. And so, it is a big piece of infrastructure for sure, but it is a totally crucial tool to what we do with condors. Now, there's a lot of the acclimatization that happens as well. So when we get birds, we get them from the zoo about 4 weeks ahead of when we intend to release them, and we hold them for that time. And it gives them time to socialize not only with each other inside the pen, with a mentor, if we have a mentor from the zoo, but also with the external flock who does come to the site. They see birds in the pen, they're interested, and so they're interacting through the pen. And so there's a huge amount of social interaction going on. It also allows us to provide ample food and water, things that condors need to survive on the landscape. So we want this to be a comfortable place. We want the condors to spend time in there and really feel like, wow, I've got everything I need here. I've got food, I've got water, I've got roosting opportunities, I've got social time with flock mates. And I always refer to it as kind of Club Med for condors. We want them to really, kind of see it as a comfortable place. Then when we release the individuals, they're not looking to take off and find somewhere that's better. They're like, wow, I've got everything I need right here. Why do I need to go somewhere else and emigrate away from this area? Also, we only release individuals when they seem ready. So are they ready to go out? Do they seem like they're interacting well with the rest of the group? We look for things like, are they roosting well? Are they socially confident? Are they feeding with other individuals? Or are they hiding in a corner and only venturing over to the carcass like after dark or when there's no one else near it? We don't want them to be cowed, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be the most dominant bird in the pen, but when a dominant bird is aggressive towards them, do they try and disperse the negative attention? Do they just walk away from it and or provide proper subordinate cues to kind of move that negative attention or that aggressive attention away from them, but still hold their ground and hold place in the pen rather than, like I said, cowering in a corner. And And then if birds seem like they're not quite ready, there's other birds that are more aggressive, more dominant, that are doing really well. And we're like, okay, that bird seems like they're really ready to go out and engage with the wild flock. Then we can use that, the double door trap, and we can move those individuals and release them while holding other individuals that seem a little more subdued, not quite as confident, and hold them for a longer period of social learning time with other birds that are being held in the pen or with mentors, and kind of allow them to grow a little bit longer socially. So I'm going to give you a couple of views here. This is actually the very first release that we ever did, and there's no condors out right now. So that makes it a little bit challenging. The birds were very nervous. There was no social group to integrate with. And so that makes it a little less of a soft release. And this gives you an impression of what it's like for a condor that's kind of exiting the pen. It's a little more nervous. It doesn't have a social group to get into, and these birds just took off from the site. The first one that left, A3, it took him over 3 weeks to get back to the site. He just kind of took off, went in a direction, and didn't really have a great anchor to the site. We still had put them, allowed them to spend quite a bit of time in the pen, but there wasn't a social group to interact with. Just a couple of birds later, well, we had some birds on the outside, and you can see this bird here exiting the pen. You can see there's a bird down at the bottom, so there's a bird already on the outside. This bird's walking out into a social situation, and that's a lot more kind of, it calms them down a lot. They feel like they're feeding inside. They're walking right out to feed outside with birds that they've been socialized with outside, and it just kind of diffuses a lot of their stress. So that's an ideal soft release right there, in my mind. And I have another example of that with B1 here. B1's feeding. We didn't have a mentor in the pen, so we were able to just open the main pen door and just let the bird walk out. He'd been feeding at that carcass right there. He walked out, and you can see as he makes that transition to the wide open world, he's nervous, he's ready to fly, and then he sees that, oh, it's not really that bad. I can just feed right out here too. Now, unfortunately, he decides to challenge the most dominant bird at the site right off the bat, which doesn't work out so well for him. But it was a very soft release, and you can see that he just walked out. Now he's a little bit more stressed about the bird outside than he is about being out in the wild. And after only a few minutes, he does walk right back up the hill there and go to the pool and kind of engage with the pool. So some of the other post-release conditions that we want to make sure that we have kind of available for the birds, similar to what I was talking about for inside the pen. Make sure that the exterior site is very appealing to the individuals post-release. Proffered food resources to help anchor them to the site. Play items. People probably don't feel like condors are a really playful species, maybe, if you don't know them, but they are. We've got a scale on the outside, and the young birds love it. They go out there, they jump on it, they pick at it. It's a really novel item to them. As I mentioned, we have a pool there. We have food resources out there. And then he'll take off in a minute, and you'll be able to see the pen, which you might have been able to see in that previous image of the pen. There's ample roosting on the pen itself, so they don't even have to leave the release site to be able to get up off the ground, get onto comfortable roosts, and feel comfortable at the site. Again, outside is kind of a club med for condors. It's a really big bathing pool there. And you can see the roosting opportunities right on the pen. We prefer to create some more naturalistic roosting for them rather than have them roosting right on the metal. So that's why we've put kind of the tree branches up on top there. Drinking water and bathing is available. I mentioned that. And while they're not otters, they are almost like an aquatic species. Condors love to bathe, and having a really nice bathing opportunity for them has been, I think, a really big boon to making the site attractive to them and kind of draw them in. And the pool ends up being a big social interactive area. It's been a little bit challenging with avian influenza now on the landscape. We do have turkey vultures come in and use the water. We have ravens come in and use the pool, other bird species, and we have concerns about it harboring avian influenza. So we're now at a point where we're just about disinfecting the pool nightly. We do all of our work at the site during nighttime hours so that the birds can't actually see us doing work. We do everything in the dark, putting out food, cleaning, doing maintenance work. So the pool is cleaned out and bleached at probably at least every other day, if not nightly at times. Like I said, again, it's kind of like Club Med for condors. The other thing is that because the other birds come in and they're drawn to new birds in the pen, they want to see what's happening, they want to see who's there. It really does kind of make this a social hub so that these wild birds come in, they interact with captive birds, and when the captive birds are released out, they don't have to go out seeking other condors. It's all happening right there at the site. And that just really kind of makes for a lot of site fidelity in the birds that are released, and I think reduces birds expanding out across the landscape too quickly, especially with unflighted birds, have never been out flying around before. As far as monitoring goes, all of the birds have GPS transmitters and VHF transmitters, one on each wing. The GPS ones allow us to do kind of analysis of how they're using the habitat, how quickly they're expanding their range, look at different resources they're using, assess risks. The VHF transmitter allows us to go out with a radio receiver and find the birds kind of real time on the ground. Those are also set with a mortality setting. So they have a different pulse rate for the radio signal if they haven't moved for a certain period of time, which alerts us to the fact that we may need to go out and chase birds around, maybe render aid or recover a carcass if a bird does succumb, and then allow us to kind of figure out what happened with that individual. We also trap up the birds twice a year, spring and fall. This allows us to do physical checks on all of the birds. We can replace transmitters and tags. As you see happening here, we can also take blood, which allows us to look at, to see if they're getting into contaminants in the field or if there's any kind of disease issues. And then at the same time, we can also administer vaccines. At this point, we're vaccinating for West Nile virus and for the new highly pathogenic avian influenza. And again, having that social area around the pen where birds feel very comfortable really greatly eases your ability to get hands on birds again, to trap them again. We're going to initiate trapping actually tomorrow. So we're going to start our fall trapping just tomorrow, and it's going to be, see how many birds we can get into the pen tomorrow. So now I'm going to go through a little bit of the regulatory approach that we occurred, and there's going to be a lot of words here. I apologize for that. But just to give you an idea of how long it took for us to get where we are today. It was 2003 that a panel of Yurok elders decided that condor was the top terrestrial conservation issue for the tribe, and it took until 2008 to receive the first grant from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to investigate the potential for bringing condors back to the Pacific Northwest. That same year, Redwood National Park, kind of as the link to the National Park Service, along with state parks, joined the tribe in starting to do assessments on the habitat targeting condor's return, which is kind of the beginning of the NCCRP, the Northern California Condor Restoration Program, which is a joint program between the National Park Service, state parks, and the Yurok Tribe. Now, it took from there until 2014 to get an agreement. We decided that maybe getting an agreement between the tribe, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, parks, both state and federal, and the Ventana Wildlife Society, who had been doing condor reintroductions for some time, just to kind of get a formal agreement in place saying that condor recovery in the Pacific Northwest was a good idea. This agreement was expanded later. The same year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service suggested to use Section 10J of the Endangered Species Act, which is a way to kind of relax the Endangered Species Act in order to bring other stakeholders on board with us. And in 2015, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with the NCCRP began a NEPA process, a National Environmental Policy Act process, formally. In only 6 years, the NEPA process was completed and we reached a finding of no significant impact. The 10J approach was also approved by the Department of the Interior that same year. And that same year, the state of California accepted that the 10J approach seemed like a good approach and enacted law aligning state law to kind of align with the 10J ESA approach so that kind of everything kind of was able to move together in tandem. That same year, we began building the release site, and 1 year later, we received our first cohort of condors. So it took a big chunk of time. Now, with the tribe deciding that condors was the way that they wanted to go forward in 2003 to 2022, receiving our first cohort of condors, 19 years was a big chunk of time. So I don't want people involved in sea otter recovery to feel dissuaded in any way here. It just took quite a while, and there were some hurdles that we had to get over. I think it seems like things are moving a little more quickly for sea otters in our area. And a little bit more on the 10J. So that's, again, a way to relax the Endangered Species Act rules and keep certain rules in place that seem to be beneficial, and that way bring on board some land management entities who might otherwise oppose what's going to happen. So in our case, unintentional take is allowed as long as it's take that occurs accidentally during otherwise lawful activities. So things like livestock grazing, timber harvest, standard land use actions are not considered disturbance, nor is it considered take if condors are accidentally taken during those activities. Nests are protected from both visual and noise disturbance. So tree falling, chainsaws, use of explosives, things like that are restricted around nesting areas. This allowed us to bring in a lot of like the timber industry, energy transmission and production industry, groups that maybe would have opposed condors coming onto the landscape, another endangered species to deal with, actually ended up supporting the work and getting on board with the process. So using all of these different methods I've been talking about, the overall condor recovery program, which is a program run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has achieved a whole lot in the last several decades. At the end of 2023, there were 344 condors in the wild, with 561 condors overall alive today, which is a 2,450% increase from the population low. So that's moving things in really good directions. In only 3 years, our program in Northern California has reintroduced 18 condors to the Pacific Northwest. And this is a little of how that looks here. You can see just over the last couple of years, the range expansion. Well, the range in 2023 was 1,100 square miles. And in one more year, this last year, the range has expanded by almost 2,400 square miles. So the birds are ranging over 3,500 square miles at this point. So quite a big range, but they are all coming back to that social hub at our release area, allowing us to work on management. At some point, they're going to find some nice areas and set up breeding territories and not come home. And that's, of course, my nightmare because, my job is overseeing the management. But that will also mean that the birds are moving into a new phase, which will be exciting. So great. We're all finished, right? Why are we doing this in the first place, though? I mean, what happened to condors that caused this? Some of you probably have heard this story before, and know the story, but for others of you, what were we saving condors from? Well, if we look at kind of the population trend over time, you can see if we ignore the green bars in this graph here, if we look at the light blue and the light blue is wild-fledged birds, which we are getting birds fledging out of wild nests, but the dark blue is deaths. If you know anything about populations and population biology, you know that if you have more birds dying than being produced, you've got a decreasing population. And that's what we're seeing if you look at every single year on this graph from 2010 to 2023, more birds dying than being produced. So the reason that condors are increasing is because we're producing a lot in captivity and putting them out there. And that's still the case. And that's kind of a little unsettling. It's a little sobering. So that would seem to indicate that perhaps reintroductions were a little premature, but there was good reasons to initiate reintroductions. Number one, there was no condors on the landscape for quite some time. They were extinct in the wild. And so there was land managers out there that were saying, hey, these areas have restrictions on them because of condors, but there's no condors here. We want to start doing development. So in order to maintain those condor conservation areas, there needed to technically be some condors there. So that was one reason. Another reason was they didn't really know at that time why condors were failing. And so it wasn't until we were able to put some good tracking devices on them and start putting birds back out there so that we could see what happened. We were at that point able to kind of figure out. And here's kind of a look at that. This is deaths within the reintroduction population where there's a cause of death known. And so you can see this big chunk of the pie over here, 48% of the deaths coming from lead toxicosis or lead poisoning. And some researchers have dug in even a little bit deeper and found that some of these deaths from power line collisions, predation, illness, and disease, also when those carcasses were assessed, there was high levels of lead in a lot of those individuals as well. So it was probably lead toxicosis and intoxication was probably a contributing factor to some of those mortalities as well. Probably actually quite a large number of them. And so here's the culprit here. You can see this is a deer neck, a deer that was shot with lead ammunition. And you can see all of the white, kind of what we call the snowstorm effect out here. This is all fragmented lead. Now this bullet did go through a neck, which causes even larger amounts of fragmentation, but even hitting soft tissue, what lead ammunition does is it mushrooms and it fragments, and that's really what it's supposed to do. That's how a high-speed lead projectile dumps its kinetic energy into the tissues of a live animal. It mushrooms, it fragments, it dumps its energy in, and that becomes a kinetic shock wave, which travels through, or a hydrostatic shock wave, which travels through the animal and disrupts tissue, nerves, capillary beds, things like that, puts an animal down quickly and humanely. So that's something that's relatively easy to remedy by simply transitioning from lead ammunition to non-lead ammunition. There's other things that we can do. We can provide clean food for birds. We can treat birds that actually do get lead toxicosis. But the biggest thing is to engage with the hunting and shooting community. It's not just hunters. There's land managers that use firearms as management tool. And engage with those communities to help them become part of the solution, not point fingers at them and point them out as part of the problem, but really engage with them and say, hey, you guys are our saviors. And so there's a lot of work being done on that. Because this, being the treatment end, from one round of trapping in Southern California, this is what the treatment pen looks like at the LA Zoo. This is not really the way forward. Really, prevention is going to be the way to deal with it. But it's kind of a stark message, since mortality is still happening even years and years after the banning of lead ammunition. There's still so many birds getting it. So This image here from Jesse Grantham, a past coordinator of the Condor program for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, looking at a condor that's sitting above this human augmented landscape. Is this possible? It's a difficult thing when you're trying to deal with a species that doesn't seem to get along so well with people when anthropogenic, with anthropogenic issues kind of creating such a problem for them. That's one of the reasons that we looked to Northern California and the Pacific Northwest portion of the species range, the past historical range. It's a place with a lot smaller human footprint on it. And we think that these more pristine habitats may be a little bit easier for condors to reintegrate into kind of the existing ecosystems and communities in those areas and maybe have a little bit easier go of it. So how do these lessons that we've learned from condors translate to other species? And I apologize again, there's going to be a lot of words right here. One thing is, if possible, address your sources of mortality before you get started, if you know what they are. I have a little note here, lead is lucky. It doesn't seem like lead is lucky from all the stuff I just showed you and the numbers. But for us, it's lucky because it's a single thing. Like there's really one big mortality factor that's impacting condors that we've been able to come up with. And if we can address that, we can solve the issues for condors and they can go on their merry way and recover. And that would be amazing. So lead is lucky in that respect. Of course, we have avian influenza. That's a different thing. But if you do have high sources of mortality in the environment, it's a waste of funding. It's a waste of your animals, your most crucial resource that you have available to you for your conservation work. And of course, mortalities weaken public support and they're morally inappropriate. You don't want to put animals out there to fail. You want to put animals out there to thrive. So if possible, introduce your animals into a healthy system where you've already addressed mortalities. Again, translocations, reintroductions should target a new and thriving population. And you really need to know your system. Systemic work may need to be done prior to reintroductions if the system is degraded to a point where it can't support a species. And I'm thinking of keystone species, especially with this next point. If the system is challenged due to the lack of the target species, introductions may need to occur in tandem with other work on the system. I'm thinking of species like sea otters where, kelp forests have been degraded to a large extent. Do we need to do work on the kelp forests and other aspects of the system simultaneously to create kind of at least a starting point system that can then expand maybe of its own accord after we get it kind of stabilized? You also need to know your species behavior. This has been crucially important with condors. They're a very, very social species. And we've been able to use a lot of those social behaviors to kind of help us manage the birds. We can use things to lure birds into areas, and we can use social interactions and behaviors to affect timing of our work. We can use what we know about behaviors amongst individuals to kind of influence how we make up our management groups. And we can use specific individuals as targets to use as social magnets or to use in other ways to kind of initiate social cues amongst groups. And that can greatly ease our monitoring and recapture by allowing us to modify how the individuals have site affinity for our release area and be able to bring them in and kind of use that as a way to kind of really manipulate the population and manipulate individuals, manipulate our release events and things like that. So I think that I can't stress that enough. It's just something that we use every day in condor conservation. Keep your restoration footprint small unless you don't. And I already talked to you a little bit about our huge amount of infrastructure that we use with condors. Part of that is we've been working with condors for 3 decades, and we know kind of how condors are affected by the infrastructure. We can provide resources and ways to protect the animals with the infrastructure that we use. and not worry so much about the impacts of the infrastructure. We can protect them from human interactions at the site. And you got to keep in mind that these animals are going to live in a world that's occupied by people. They're going to interact with human infrastructure all the time once they get out into the wild. So really trying to figure out if what you're doing is in some way making human infrastructure appealing to them. And initially with condors, we had Simrock covering everything. Everything was kind of just, making it look as natural as possible. And then the birds took off and they landed on a radio tower like almost immediately. And it's like, okay, did any of that make any difference? So then they started playing with different structures that they were releasing them from, and they didn't see any difference in the sort of affinity that the birds had to naturalistic roosting structures versus radio towers. It was all about, hey, this is a great place for me to perch and look over the landscape and utilize as a way to move around the landscape, more than it was, oh, I was in a metal cage, so now I'm going to roost on a metal structure. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about what kind of infrastructure you need to use, and don't panic if the infrastructure seems large. Really isolating the animals from people may be the biggest deal. Final word about the ESA, because that's what we're all here for, right? The ESA at 50. The Endangered Species Act brings a large array of organizations to the table. There's a lot of different groups that are triggered by initiating kind of a listing of a species or having a species listed. And it provides an organized process to initiate conservation action, which I think is good. It also brings a lot of funding sources to the table, not just federally, but a lot of nonprofit organizations and other organizations that provide funding for endangered species conservation kind of use the Endangered Species Act and listing as a way to kind of decide how money should be distributed. And so, if condors were delisted tomorrow, we would have a lot harder time bringing money to the table, and that's not a reason to keep animals listed for sure. But I think it's a good tool that can really help in that aspect of things, and getting funding and bringing groups together. So with that, I can answer questions. I think I have one more video here of condors in flight, but like I said, I can answer any questions if people have them.
Thanks, Chris. I wanted to watch the video too. So amazing. I love going to the Oregon Zoo and seeing the condors up close in person. They are just astoundingly magnificent to see in real life. Thanks for sharing the California condor reintroduction story. I learned a lot. And I think our audience did as well. I do have some questions for you. Let's see, Bob is curious, is there an overall coordinated strategy or plan for condors that links all the release efforts across the Western region and seeks future releases in other areas like Idaho?
There is, like I said, the California Condor Recovery Program is the large kind of overarching program run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It is somewhat of a loose structure. We do have meetings every year. And I think it's not like we have a large plan moving forward. There has been talk about moving other or initiating some other releases in the Pacific Northwest, Idaho, northeastern Oregon, but nothing is set. There's not any kind of a timeline on it. And it's a lot more loosey-goosey than you would think, really. But even the recovery plan itself, the last recovery plan was written in 1996. So at that point in time, we weren't even sure that lead was an issue for condors. So the service has decided to not develop a new recovery plan If they did, I'm sure that there would be some more about what are the ways forward and what are the future pathways. But there's not really anything out there structured like that at this time.
Okay, we've got a question from Sammy. She asks, since condors' primary food source historically were megafauna and marine mammals, can we expect them to reach viable numbers without those present? And she also added, the lead poisoning mortality rate seems to indicate that they are largely feeding on carcasses coming from game animals.
Well, to a certain extent, I think that recovery of marine mammal populations is a big deal. And if you look at the numbers of turkey vultures seen in Christmas bird counts, I kind of looked at those years ago and noticed that around the 1900s, when there were very few pinnipeds along the Oregon coast and Northern California coast, turkey vultures dropped off from Christmas, or that was actually kind of when Christmas bird counts were initiated. There really weren't turkey vultures occurring on those counts. And now the numbers have ramped up, kind of almost paralleling recovery of a lot of the pinniped species along the coast, which I thought was extremely interesting. And I really wonder if that's going to be a food resource that's going to be important for condors especially during winter months, when perhaps inland foraging will be curtailed because of winter conditions. So I'm really hopeful about the recovery of pinnipeds, increasing numbers of whales, and also returning salmon. Condors were seen to forage on spawned out salmon during the salmon runs on the rivers back in the early 1900s. And so I'm really hopeful, or sorry, 1800s. I'm hopeful that, if we can get salmon numbers back up, dam removals, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the Klamath Dam removals. Only weeks after some of the removals, salmon moving up channels and moving into areas where they haven't been seen in over a century. I think that bodes really well. And I think that there is certainly, there's been recovery of elk populations and other large ungulates on the landscape. We've got wolves coming back in. There's talk about recovery of grizzlies, which maybe we'll hear some more about. So that's all, I think we're seeing a lot of changes to the ecosystems that hopefully will bode well. A lot of the condors that are being affected by lead in more recent years, we are actually getting more and more birds with GPS transmitters, and we're able to follow where they're going. And we're finding that a lot of them are not being affected by necessarily big game hunting, but by land management action. So people that are out there shooting varmint species, such as coyotes and ground squirrels and things like that. So in a lot of cases, we don't know exactly what's happening. Condors disappear into a large area of private managed land that we don't have access to. They come back with lead. We don't know exactly where the lead's coming from, but it does not appear to be big game harvest necessarily, in a lot of cases. I think the big game hunting community has done a really good job with not only the changes in legality of hunting with lead ammunition, which is illegal in California now, but also with engagement. When we go out and we engage with hunters, by and large, they know what the rules are. Most of them are happy with the way that the non-lead ammunition is performing, and those transitions are occurring, and the hunting community is on board. It's about getting the larger land management community on board, and it's a harder thing to reach those people because you don't have Big Game Hunter Digest, where you can, the state can put out here's the rules, here's why we're doing it, here's how it affects wildlife. People that are using firearms in ways other than big game hunting are much harder to reach because they're not necessarily a specific group that is attainable, with messaging in the same way. Sorry, that was meandering. I hope I answered some of the question there.
I think you did. We have another question. Do you know if the condors that you release ever dip down into the range of the Pinnacles and Big Sur release condors?
They do not. They are pretty far from those ranges at this time. I think the furthest south our birds have gotten is Leggett, California, which again, I had the map here, but I won't try and get back to it because I'll probably mess things up. I could try. But so they've gotten to about 9 miles south of the Oregon border, and then just a little bit east, about as far east as like the Trinity Alps Wilderness. Oh, there it is. So here's Leggett. So the Bay Area is actually about 3 times further, or twice as far as this point here. And then this up here, the Oregon border is just up here. So they were just shy of the Oregon border. Trinity Alps Wilderness and Hayfork, California are here. Redding is probably about this far. So that gives you an idea kind of where they're ranging at this point. They certainly could connect to the Pinnacles and Central California flocks. They have to get around the Bay Area, so that would be a challenging one. The most likely route is to go over and connect to the Northern Sierras. So it's almost more likely that they would connect with the Southern California flocks prior to the Central California flocks if they did travel down through the Sierra Nevada range.
So there's a lot of similarities, I feel like, between California condor reintroduction with the Yurok Tribe and what we're trying to do with Elakha Alliance and the Siletz Tribe and a few other tribes here in Oregon to bring sea otters back. So very great question from Bob. Was the tribal council or the elders involved throughout the whole 19-year process trying to get the condors reintroduced?
Well, the council was involved in really kind of engaging with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service initially, and their initial questions related to it really came down to the service saying, well, there's nothing in the recovery plan that says there needs to be range-wide recovery, and you know, there's only so much funding and resources out there to do condor reintroduction. So when the tribe kept pushing for engagement and started, you know, really getting the studies done, you know, after hiring myself and some of our other biologists on to kind of look at the question, and the service came back and said, there's just not enough resources. And so that at that point, the tribe said, well, we'll do it ourselves. So you know, we'll come up with the funding, we'll have the biologist in place and do all of that part of the work. And National Park Service, you know, through Redwood National and State Parks said, this will be a great thing for our region and we really want to be involved. And so, yes, the tribe continuing to have a seat at the table was definitely the intent of the council. And it was the council's intent to continue to fundraise and you know, initiate condor reintroduction in this portion of the range, just because they're, you know, like I said, the federal agencies only had so much money to go around. They had their own release site going. They're overseeing the overall release process. To get themselves spread too thin would have been detrimental overall to the program. But with the tribe coming forward and saying, we can support this piece and make this happen, I think that's what really made it seem more attainable to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Awesome. Well, we do have a couple more questions in the Q&A, but we don't have enough time to say them out loud. So Chris, if you have a couple moments to type in the answers for those 2 questions, that I'm sure they would appreciate that. But thank you so much for coming on here today. And I'm sure we'll be in touch pretty soon.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Chris.